All right, guys, it looks like I'm live now. I unmuted. I think I might have been talking to myself. Looks like we're good to go. I have a full show prepared today, and there's a lot of different material that we're going to discuss. I'm happy to dive back into the parallel mind architecture and the way that I'm personally thinking about it. And the big thing that I want to mention about this particular space and the reason that we do this show on the parallel mind is because we're trying to fundamentally ascertain solutions for our current polycrisis that we're enduring as a species, right? So, and some of the understandings, if you will, of the situation that we find ourselves in is potentially extremely bleak, right? And that is, in my opinion, the black pilled version. And what this really has to do with is the frame, right? The frame of mind or the frame of reference that we approach our current issues as a species. The other way to look at the current situation that we're in, and when I refer to situation, I'm talking about the poly crisis, the meaning crisis, the seeming sense that we're losing control, that we're careening toward the cliffside, about to fly over a cliff into our absolute doom. One second, I'm getting distracted by messages here. I need to get rid of this app like right away. One second, my friends. That's really annoying. Mute everything. Just a minute. All right, just exited completely out of that. That'll be gone. Okay, so there's this sense that we are on the precipice of destruction from a black pilled perspective. And you see media, literature, books, and all types of material being written about, people pontificating about it, channels discussing it, groups philosophizing around it. But it's just this notion that we're embedded in a key term that a lot of people use is collapse, right? Or a collapse scenario. Now, the other way to look at this is that we're in a spiritual emergency, right? That this is a time of transformation and a time of opportunity. I tend to view our current situation in the language of the latter, meaning that we are on the precipice of great change and transformation as a species, and that we have an opportunity to unlock a future potential better planet, a better version of ourselves, and a better version of our technologies. The people in Web3, in crypto and blockchain, who, if they don't use the same language that I'm using here, refer to this movement as the regenerative movement or a push toward regenerative ecosystems, a revival of this concept of bioregionalism. And through these different channels and these different modes of talking about or thinking about this particular idea, you see that there is a group of people who consider that there is an opportunity for us to move forward and better ourselves as a species. Okay. And so, my idea for how we get there, and I think there is definitely a catastrophe scenario, right? We could actually reach an extinction level event if we don't act and take the proper precautions and make the necessary changes for our collective action to create a better world, right? So this, in my opinion, is a choice, but I think that the deck is not as stacked against us as some of the naysayers and doom mongers and fear mongers would have us believe, right? I think with our technological prowess, cultural and social developments of the last couple of decades, I think we have a tremendous amount of wisdom that has been accumulated over time that we can bring to bear for the development of new kinds of tools and technologies to move us into a better future. And we can do all of this, and this is critical, right? We can do all of this without changing the fundamental quote unquote nature of the human being or of our psychology. And I want to take a moment here to refute this before we get into the like the meat of the matter. There are people out there who make the case that we are naturally heading down this path of self-annihilation or destruction because it is an innate property of human psychology, of the human genetic template, right? The so-called warrior gene. I'm of the mindset that that is just a singular, a one-sided view of human beings. Certainly, we are geared to potentially act on certain awful impulses, especially if whatever that impulse is somehow brings better status to our individual character, somehow puts us in a better position in life, or betters us or others. I think this is less about genetic destiny and more about like cultural prize factors. And what I mean by that is the game dynamics in society, right? Which are what we create via our institutions and via our cultures, right? Meaning that if we reward certain kinds of behaviors, then in an epigenetic fashion, very much humans who are more predisposed to that kind of bad behavior in society are going to gravitate to trying to game that particular system and to gobble up all of the rewards as a result. So I think this is really a question of design. If we design our communities and our systems in a certain way, in a way that rewards positive some game theoretic behavior, then very naturally we are going to improve how humans respond in an environment to the game theoretic variables in that environment, right? Meaning the type of jobs you acquire, the way that you are rewarded for certain kind of behavior, right? The incentives, the ability to gain individual progress, also the ability to fulfill yourself and for people to fulfill themselves spiritually and materially and culturally, and all of these things matter. So, what this means is getting right the governance and the coordination and the institutionals is what we'll call it of our societies, and I think that's what we're working on right now in the context of Web3 with the regenerative community. This is what in my opinion, is at least a side project or enterprise of the cypherpunks and crypto anarchists. Even though they're more focused on like preventing the consequences of the zero sum games, which are right mass surveillance, attacks on individual sovereignty and liberty, attacks on collectives who are activists, et cetera, and those kind of things. Cool. So wanted to break that down real quick. Let's get into the meat of this. I think where we're at in this great transition period, we're trying to reconcile a lot of different ways of thinking about how we're pushing into the future and what futurism actually looks like. And I'm personally of the mindset that people like Teilhard de Chardin, who was a paleontologist, you guys are familiar. We've had discussions on de Chardin before. He was the guy that the intellectual that predicted the concept of the noosphere, right? The noosphere is just the notion that the planet is becoming more interconnected in terms of its communication networks over time, and that it is exhibiting the potential for mind or some type of mentation or even rudimentary cognition, volition, volitional consciousness, etc. So let me permit me to provide you guys with an anecdote. With a vision that I had at one point in my life that has kept me thinking about these matters for roughly 10 years. I've been thinking about philosophy for longer than that, of course, anarchism, crypto anarchism, libertarianism, and various philosophies thereof. But I started to broaden my philosophy around 10 years ago. There was a time in Acapulco when I was there for the Anarchapulco conference, and I took a pill of MDMA at this event. And I've taken the chemical before on a number of occasions, and it has always had profound impacts on my personal psychology, my ability to deal with latent traumas, and to begin to appreciate myself more than I had in the past. Be, and I think largely that a lot of us do this because MDMA has the unique capacity to help us process traumas. Well, one of the things that I was doing as I grew accustomed to using the substance was using it as a meditative sort of experience. And so, in this particular occasion, I was sitting with my wife on a terrace in Acapulco looking out over the beach. Some of you guys have maybe heard me recount this story before, but I think it's relevant for anybody who's new and who's watching this feed. I begin to see this scene, and typically, and the scene that was happening and occurring on the beach while I was in this reverential state on MDMA, and I was hitting the peak of the experience, and everything was extremely euphoric. The tactile sensations were at their pinnacle, right? And any of you guys who have experienced this, it's like your body you become more hyper aware of your body and your sensations. Your thinking is more augmented, more prophetic, deeper, more connective. You definitely feel as if you're connected with everything in your vicinity, and this happens largely as a result of the brain being flooded with serotonin, and then there's a cascade effect of oxytocin and dopamine and other neurotransmitters and neurohormones being dumped sort of simultaneously into the brain and into the bloodstream, right? So what I saw in this moment was all the grains of sand on the beach. It's like I could perfectly see and experience each one of them, and they began to like oscillate, and they began to move and to grow together and to form some type of start forming some type of object on the beach. And this began to happen in the form of a pattern and as a cascading element of a variety of different particles coming together, and it was like they were dancing almost rhythmically, and then it seemed to be that to me that they were being constructed. Something of the grains of sand were constructing and coming together, and then it was growing and stacking on top of itself sort of hierarchically, and then each element of sand was nested in another element of sand. And the words that came into my mind at that point of what I was witnessing was almost like a futuristic vision. The idea that we are building something as not only as a species, like purposely, but also we're part of something, a greater whole that is building some type of technology. Technology is the best word I can use to describe this, and that it's growing on itself, and that there's a goal or a destination involved in the development of whatever is happening, and somehow our activities as human beings on this planet are involved with it and we're connected to it. And in the moment, I had been reading Terence McKenna's work, right? I had been very familiar with his material, especially from the Archaic Revival, and I was just familiarizing myself at the time with Ray Kurzweil's work and the singularity is near. And then I had sort of the intuition that McKenna, coming from a more spiritual, sort of psychedelically infused background, uh, that was his perspective, whereas Kurzweil was coming more from a technologist background, a little bit of a less spiritual background, more of a scientifically oriented one, if you will. And what I realized is that they were saying the same things, that there is something that we are working toward in development as a species, and that we are building. And some people have referred to this as building a god at the end of time, constructing some type of artifice that has a deep connection or resonance with and in the whole planet. And this is effectively, this was before I really started studying Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, but I was familiar with his work at the point, but I didn't know it in detail. But he had already been talking about this and had predicted something similar to this vision that I had prior to McKenna or Kurzweil talking about it. And he patterned this around this notion of the noosphere, this collective psyche. Some people have simply referred to this as a prediction of the internet of mass hyperconnectivity on the planet, and I think that does an injustice to the full scope of Chardin's work, which I'm going to get into here in a minute. But the overarching idea is that the planet is becoming more highly interconnected, and that somehow it is awakening as a part of this process. Of course, in Kurzweil's vision, this is what he refers to as the singularity, which is more very specifically related to artificial intelligence. And the idea with the singularity is that artificial intelligence becomes super intelligent and begins to replicate itself and to develop more super intelligent machines. And then these machines end up dotting the whole universe with the stuff of mind, right? So it's this intelligence explosion. So I think that's part of the story. Certainly, artificial intelligence or various kinds of synthetic intelligences have to do with this type of birth here at the quote unquote end of history. And I think that is a beautiful, like one part of this vision of ecstasis at the end of history. But I think also what this more references is the actual planet itself becoming intelligent, becoming awakened. And here's the thing that's critical with my personal vision. And I've said this to you guys before, and for you guys who are new, I'm going to say it again. A lot of what I'm talking about right now sounds extremely metaphysical. Some might even say it sounds crunchy, granola, rainbows and unicorns, and that it is totally metaphysical and makes no sense in a scientific context. And I think if you're looking at this purely from the constraints of like metaphysics and spirituality, it's going to look like that. But if you look at this from the point of view of historical reality, of what's happening in the sciences, what is converging socially, politically, culturally, and technologically, what we're actually witnessing is the birth of a new kind of a coordination mechanism for the earth. We're witnessing a myriad of different emergent properties, right, within the context of the earth. And I think this is the initial phases of this type of paradigm shift, and really this awakening of planetary consciousness. And I don't think this is something that is just happening, right? In a metaphysical sense, like Chardin, his idea was that this like noosphere, through the process of planetization, is the term that he used, comes to a head with the creation or the unification of divinity, and this he referred to as the omega point. I think in a very real physical sense, instead of this automatically happening, right? I mentioned to you guys earlier that what Chardin predicted is, or what he talked about, is theological in nature, right? He was also a Catholic priest, aside from a paleontologist in his background, who's a Jesuit, right? So he had a spiritual kind of MO, like modus operandi behind his visions, or a spiritual impulse. I think that this is something that we purposely have to build, and I think this is the reason for consciousness. This is the reason for humans' ability to create tooling to solve problems. And I think that if we just look at our current scientific context, we can see that things are manifesting around our technologies and our cultures, and it has put us into a position to potentially see that this is a project or a blueprint that we can purposely engineer toward, right? And this, if we think of this as an engineering project with a timeline and a goal, and that we can actually build toward this, it's something that we can all work toward in a developmental sense, right? It doesn't have to be metaphysical. And something that I haven't talked about in the past, and I want to talk about it now with regard to Chardin's work, because we need to be critical about some of his ideas, and we need to think about them in modern context with current changes. So his book has been shit on by mainstream science. You know, right? I'm talking when I say his book. I'm you guys who don't know, I'm referring to the phenomenon of man, also referred to as the phenomenon of humanity. In the book, of course, you guys are familiar now with his thesis that the planet is undergoing a transformation into like consciousness and a unification with divinity at the end of time. Uh, Really, what all of this boils down to in Chardon's thought is that there is a process that's built in to nature, right? It's fundamental to nature and to reality. And he referred to this as a complexity consciousness. The idea that consciousness is a fundamental unit of reality and it's embedded in everything. This is also in line with the philosophical tradition of panpsychism, which is also, by the way, gaining more popularity. I've talked about that in the philosophical zeitgeists parallel mind discussion that I had. But the idea is that every unit of matter, every particle in the universe has some level of consciousness, according to panpsychist thought. So Chardon's view, of course, was even more mystical or spiritual. It was that every every bit of matter in the universe is inherently conscious, but not only that, but it is moving along an axis, and its interiority is the term that he uses, becoming more complex over time. So this is the process he referred to as complexification. Things are becoming more complex as they move forward, and this complexity is an inbuilt property of the universe. Really, design. It's designed, quote unquote, in a sense, where it has a goal in mind. So Chardonian philosophy is inherently teleological, right? It means that there is an impulse at the end of time that it's moving toward. This was also a sentiment that Terence McKenna shared, although I don't recall in his many lectures that I have watched him explicitly referring to Chardon, but he called the same idea novelty theory. He said that nature is really an engine, an engine for the manufacture and the creation of novelty over time. So novelty basically just means new forms are being created all the time, and this is happening through the process of emergence, right? Or emergent properties. New forms come about through evolution, and these new forms then create more new forms, and it continues to happen like this over time. And by the way, anybody who is scientifically schooled who's watching this is probably going to say, well, that's not actually what you're talking about. It's not evolution, right? Evolution is about how biological forms change through Darwinian natural selection and speciation. But when I talk about evolution in this show, I've told you guys this many times, and it's really important to remember. I'm talking about evolution from the perspective of process philosophy, which is the idea that everything in nature has evolved, right, over time, even given the fact that we are embedded in a universe that is in a process of moving toward greater disorder, right, rather than being more ordered. This is work that has already been discussed. If you look at Prigoghine's work in non-equilibrium thermodynamics, he actually won the Nobel Prize for expressing how systems can trend toward more order and more complexity in a system that is largely disordered, right? So Chardon here This is the main thing that we have to keep in mind and remember. Chardin is primarily focused on the metaphysical component. So I'm digressing here just a little bit. What I'm trying to say is that we don't have to have that metaphysical component. We just have to understand clearly and explicitly that we can engineer this because we can see the writing on the wall, right? We have the technology, we see the cultural transitions that are occurring, right? The movement toward parallel societies, the degeneration and the deconstruction of traditional nation states. We can see the continued like progression of technology, this S curve trajectory of their development and evolution. And we can take everything that we are seeing and we can begin to actually construct this planetary mind that Chardin is talking about. We can do that purposely. So, in some way, this is the, and I think this is a key point of this discussion. This is the ultimate ramification or the ultimate goal of the planetary mind, right? This is the goal. Another thing that I wanted to touch on, I know I'm jumping around a lot here, guys. Bear with me because there's a lot of material that I'm thinking about, and there's a huge different directions that we're going to go. I mentioned that Chardin's work was critiqued, and the point that I'm making is that it doesn't matter that it was critiqued because this is something that we purposely are able to generate or engineer, right? You see what I mean? It's not like a science that we like a scientific theory that we're trying to accumulate from data like that is observable in the now. That's part of the story, I think, right? But what this is more of an engineering feat, something that we can actively build or construct. This is the thesis of the parallel mind, right? And the thing that Chardin got absolutely right in his thesis, he said that over time, throughout the course of history, things change through the process of emergence, right? But this emergence, it relies on what he referred to as threshold effects, right? So when certain types of incidents, I'm just gonna call the different uh, changes in universal time incidents, th- these incidents accumulate over time. And I'm being abstract. I'm going to try to bring this back down to the concrete. But then they reach a threshold, and then something changes or emerges as a result of reaching that threshold. The example that I'm going to give is directly from Chardin's work. He had this concept that he talked about called the threshold of reflection. And the threshold of reflection is when there's a couple of ways to describe this, but one is when an organism reaches a certain point of evolution, right? When a brain grows to a certain kind of capacity, when the folds in the brain reach a certain point over time, over evolutionary time, a certain point of depth, and they're more numerous in the brain than in other animals, well, then you have a point in time when self-reflexive consciousness emerges as a result of that complexity. This is a threshold that has been reached, right? So this is related directly to the concept of emergence. And so consciousness itself is an emergent property of the evolutionary history and development of brains and brain capacity. This idea of threshold of reflection is not just applicable to the brain though, right? Anything that changes over time or evolves over time naturally reaches a threshold where a new emergent property comes about. So what we're in the business of doing now, or can be in the business of doing, is purposely working with this concept of the threshold of this like threshold capacity. So the parallel mind effectively posits that if we develop enough very specific nodes in a physical network on the earth, that we can generate more consciousness on the planet, that we can generate a kind of universal mind that emerges from the work in these nodes, right? So the analogy that I've used in the past to describe this is the brain, right? The brain would be functionally non-functional if it didn't have neurons as nodes in this network that gives rise to consciousness, right? Or ostensibly gives rise to consciousness. So the planet can be thought of in a similar fashion as a potential brain that has not become fully conscious or fully aware, but technology has drifted toward this direction incidentally, right? When I say incidentally, I mean that it hasn't necessarily been on purpose. It's just the direction that it was pushed towards. So, I, and I want to be clear here. I'm not. I don't want to make a claim whether Teilhard is wrong or right about his teleological perspectives. That this is something that was predetermined, and that there's an end goal in mind. That could be true or false. In my personal convictions don't really matter, eh, because if we're being pushed toward it anyway, it really doesn't matter. It's going to happen anyway. You see what I mean? But I'm of the mindset that we have to consider the possibility that it is not automatic, and that we have to purposely engineer toward this kind of parallel mind, right? Now, one of the architecture of this is interesting. For this to happen, I don't know all of the prerequisite variables or structures that need to be in place. But one thing that I think is clear is that we have an understanding of how computational network architectures scale, meet resource demand, and solve ever more complex problems. And this is through MPP, just massive in parallel processing. And all of our computational networks currently use MPP for scaling and efficiency gains. So I think a good way to a good analogy for this is like the development of parallel society nodes on the planet, right? So the ultimate goal, the reason why we have to develop this isn't for some woo-woo crunchy granola sort of creation of God at the end of time. We can believe that if we want to, but the purpose is actually to save ourselves, right? This is really a redemption story for the human narrative arc, if you want to look at it sort of in a mythopoetic way. But I think that we have to construct this so that we don't extinct ourselves, right? You see everyone talking about people like Daniel Schmachtenberger talking about metacrisis. You can see that we are beset by scenarios that represent crisis, right? This is a climatological collapse. This is the threat of artificial superintelligence, what could be a destruction vector rather than a survival vector. We see in synthetic biology, people can potentially create viruses like nanoviruses at their desk at home. You see oceanic dead zones, forest. You see some of the forest zones having being deforested. Actually, deforestation is massively happening around the world. So all these planetary collapse scenarios, along with technological collapse scenarios, catastrophe weapons, etc. So the goal here, or the problem first, is that all of these problems are non-solvable from a traditional or legacy institutional perspective. We can't rely on legacy institutions to solve these problems, because I mentioned at the beginning of this stream that the game theoretic dynamics are not correct, right? Everyone's playing a zero sum game in these institutions. There are very hierarchical and top down and controlling. And also, the actors that are involved are interested in solving for their own local optima, right? Their own local conditions, meaning their own power, their own wealth, their own money, their own virtue, at the expense of collective well being, right? So this is why I'm talking about these ideas right now. This is in the crux of the matter. All of these issues in our institutional design, which is a purposeful design, right, has come to head. And now we're in a space where we have solutions And so the reason that we've tried to route around in these legacy institutions by creating parallel society nodes, by embracing exit ideology, and embracing technologies that route around legacy structures, it is not simply because we want to be more free on an individual level. That is true, right? There's nothing wrong with that view, but I think that's only a very small part of it. I think like the individual liberty to engage in certain kinds of activities plays into this overarching like collective desire to save ourselves, right? And individual liberty is a part of that. So as we begin to route around these institutions, we're also providing ourselves with the capacity to target solve specific problems related to the poly crisis. Because one is we're providing ourselves with the capacity to solve institutional problems, where we can create and generate novel kinds of institutions from scratch in these parallel society nodes. We can solve governance and our crises around governance in these parallel communities. And this is because these parallel communities have a proclivity for experimentation and embracing an experimentation first ethos. And this is why, and one of my goals of this particular space is to give you guys who are thinkers a space to like comprehend the why of why all of this parallel society movement stuff is actually occurring, and what its ultimate destination or goal can be if we only put our minds together and move it in this direction. So as we construct these parallel society nodes and work out a coordination, people are also seeing, oh, I can use these spaces. We can use these communities and these spaces to solve our most vexing problems, right? This is the regulatory sandbox piece of this and the human sovereignty piece of this. If there's something that I want to be focused on, and I don't want to get caught up in the legacy zero sum game dynamic, and I want to play all the bureaucratic rules, I can do it, and I can do it a bit quicker. I can also do it while recognizing that these problems are crucial to solve as quickly as possible, while also managing like the risk vectors and the external costs of the work that I'm doing. And so you see how this is a proposal for a solution to our problems, right? Because once all of these nodes continue to get networked together and people are within each of these nodes are target solving problems that are the most vexing, say climatological change, say gets focused on by a few of these communities. Well, all of their effort is going towards solving this problem rather than just strictly politicking in a narrow domain or focused strictly on a profit margin within a narrow domain as a startup. Instead, there's some kind of like general public good, or we can call it a planetary good. I really like that term. There's a planetary good that we're focused on solving for within these communities. And the reason why the parallel processing architecture is important for this is because if you have multiple nodes, right, focused on solving a particular problem, these are akin analogously, right, or analogously to subroutines or subtasks or subsystems in a parallel processing architecture. So you're getting the scaling gains to solve that problem. You're getting the material compute and resource gains to solve that problem through these parallel node architectures. Now, all the stuff with Chardin that I talked about, you're wondering, well, how is all that relevant in this discussion? So I really like this part. I'm going to permit me to get poetic. Something I haven't talked about in the past with regard to Chardin's work is what he believed. Like all of this work of continuing complexification involves what he referred to as radial energy, and radial energy is one of the most contentious topics or contentious issues or ideas in his corpus, in his body of work. Radial energy is the interiority of the different aspects of the planetary organism, right? And radial energy is the idea that things gain in complexity in their ever forward march along this axis and this complexification, and this is interesting, it's toward this unification of love, right? Really, his whole theory was about this final motion or movement toward greater and ever increasing love at the end of history. And this was the Catholic Jesuit coming out in him, that if everything is moving and becoming more complex over time, and it's unifying around this property of love, to me, that is like the term I've used in the past is akin to a salvation device. And so, of course, this was like a, in my opinion, the more heavily theologically aligned position in Chardin's body of work, which we're only taking into account here for its interesting play in the purposeful trajectory that I'm outlining here. It's that we're really trying to save ourselves through the process of building these parallel nodes, these parallel society nodes that focus solve these problems. If there is something that accounts for the love of humankind, for the love of our species, for planetary wide salvation, it's this idea that we're all coming together at this point in history to save ourselves, right? You see, it doesn't, we don't even have to get into the metaphysics anymore, or the metaphysics are, to me, with regard to Chardin's work, a story of salvation, a story of being able to save ourselves, and a redemption arc for our species. McKenna would have said this is like having a return to the garden, right? A return to Eden. The other term that he uses is this is an archaic revival. In a way, we're going back to like our original holistic form of consciousness, and this like animistic mindset that we're all connected. But the funny thing is that we're doing this through awareness of our technological prowess, through our accumulated wisdom over time, that we have an understanding that we purposely can build toward a better future while solving our myriad of problems. But again, this can't happen if we continue to embrace legacy attitudes toward solving problems. And I have about 10 minutes left. I've got into a lot of the stuff that I wanted to get into, guys, today. I'm really happy about this. But one of the things that is working against us that we have to address is that there's a continued desire, and this is happening largely, I think, subconsciously, but it's a desire to embrace legacy political structures and legacy ways of solving problems. And even some of the ways that we think work at solving problems don't actually contribute to solving our most pressing issues, and they actually exacerbate them, right? And this is, in my opinion, the startup mindset or the startup mentality, right? I think in technological innovation, Eric Ries, who wrote a book called The Lean Startup, and this mindset for solving problems has been ubiquitous, and in a lot of domains, in very narrow domains, it has worked, right? Because what happens is that if you have a startup that's trying to solve a particular problem, they create a product, right? A software, they architect a piece of software, and then they put that piece of software on the market, and then they do feedback cycles. They iterate it, right, based on market feedback, and then they push that product out. The problem is that the the product itself may be solving a problem in a narrow domain. Potentially, that problem is something either really important. It could be really important, like you could be target solving a problem, like a planetary environmental problem, and you get profitability returns on that. Sure, that could be the case. But a lot of these startups are, if they're sheerly focused on a profit margin, which likely they are because they have stakeholders they have investors they need to appease, they have customers that they need to appease. This is the problem with the startup model, right? That it's focused on solving a problem in order to appease the bottom line. And what this does is it creates externalized costs, right? Another way to phrase this is it creates downstream consequences or downstream harms. Because say the example that I always give about this, or give regarding this, is say you have a company that is churning out a gadget or a widget, but that widget, in the creation of it, you're using some type of mineral or some type of compound, or you've created something that has toxic fallout, and that poisons a downstream water reservoir or well, and causes ecological harm or a catastrophe in a certain area, right? And so this is what I'm describing here is the crux of all of our current problems that we face, right? And so the other reason that is critical to these parallel mind nodes, these parallel society nodes, is that they have an opportunity to right this wrong, because they can embed in their tooling, their technologies, and their cultures the idea that we can't just work from a strict profit model. This is not to say that it's bad on all accounts, right? There's obvious good created from the profit model and on markets. But if we don't account for externalized costs in our work, which, by the way, this is governance, right? This is coordination. This is understanding that the profit margin at the end of the day isn't all that matters. We have to account for downstream consequences and downstream harms, or we're going to continue to exacerbate the problem. So these parallel mind nodes, which include parallel society, parallel finance, right, slash parallel economies. Uh, it includes parallel institutions. They have to harbor a mindset toward the development of public goods and thinking about like a future orientation around solving problems rather than just the bottom line. So, and I think this is also why we're seeing the development and the creation of all of these really unique funding models, right? Like leveraging quadratic funding models, retroactive funding models. It's because we understand that public goods, this is a really, right? This is a really fundamentally novel and important part of like Web3 dynamics and the Web3 culture, is that there's regenerative financial communities who understand these problems and are trying to inculcate these ideas into our communities so that we can solve these issues. But listen, most of the people in this ecosystem don't understand the full long-term ramifications of what we're talking about, which is the construction of these nodes for solving these long-term problems. You see, this is addressing the shortcoming of the market ethos and market dynamics that we've had in the context of parallel society nodes and these particular markers. I think this is really the crux, right? The centerpiece of all the work that we're currently doing in this space. And I'm going to repeat this again. The reason why you guys come and I have this discussion, I do these lectures, even though we go on a bit of a whirligig tour of all of these ideas, it is just to make the case that we can't continue to do things the old way. You guys know that, but that there is something that we can do to move forward and to save ourselves. And this is going to be really good and will continue to be good for many people, beneficial for many people, because we are so beset by black pills, by doom mongering, by abject nihilism, that most people feel lost and feel like there's nothing that we can do to move forward into the future. And yes, a lot of these ideas are currently seemingly abstract, but what matters from a very practical perspective is that we not only keep building the technologies that obsolete legacy structures, but we also continue to create parallel societies that experiment with novel governance models and that conduct research on problems that threaten our species, right? And that they happen in this protected bubble of continued work that is surrounded by an ethic of virtue, of dignity, of good treatment toward our peers, and of non-aggression, right? So it is a complete renunciation of legacy modes of being, right? This is all in parallel while embracing a forward-facing, futuristic mindset. Yeah, I think that this is gonna be toward the end of what I have to say here. We probably could have got into some more of the I wanted to get more into the history, but I ended up getting more into the future, and that's probably fine with regard to Chardin's work. But I do think that we don't need, and this is the last thing I'm gonna say. We don't have to think about any of this anymore as just rambling, incoherent mysticism, but instead we are taking everything that we know and have learned culturally and technologically as a species, and we're applying that to our survival tech here at the seemingly end of history. You see how that's I think that's a very simple explanation of what we're doing. The idea is that we finally bring our wisdom to bear to solve our most vexing crises as a species here at the end of history. And the parallel mind and its architecture, whether it's the like mythopoetic sort of uh, uh, beautiful value laden side of that philosophy, or whether it's the actual inputs for development of a parallel society that matter. Whatever perspective you take, the ultimate goal is that we are producing something physically in the real world that actually solves the problems that are threatening us or that have the potential to threaten us in this particular complex, confusing, and extremely difficult time that we live in. Cool. So thank you guys. I'm not really sure what we're going to talk about next time. I think that we're probably going to continue to get into Chardon's work. Probably want to get more into Bratton's work as well. I didn't really mention it much today. This is like and this is important too. There's a lot of people talking about this. It's not just me bloviating in this stream about these crazy zany ideas. This is there's really a revival of these ideas in different forms. The problem is a lot of these different forms, these pockets of intellectual work don't really speak to each other. So I'm really doing some work here to help synthesize some. But you have the Berguen Institute, Benjamin Bratton's work, right, on planetary computation. That's all in the same vein, except those guys are working from a more scientific and data oriented perspective, which is good. That's kind of the side that I lean to. But they also don't really share a cypherpunk mindset. They don't really understand the importance of human autonomy in this bit of it. So I want to make that known. You also have people like Alexander Bard, who wrote Process and Event. So I think process philosophy and process theology has become more prominent in recent years, and there's a lot of people thinking about it. And this is, Alfred North Whitehead, his work, and I would say that McKenna is he's a forerunner. He was a forerunner, and I actually call him Whiteheadian in his philosophy. So, and he quotes Whitehead at length in his many talks. That hasn't been reconciled, I don't think, very well with Bratton's work in planetary computation. And you also have these neo-Chardin thinkers. A lot of them are stay specifically in theological schools. Like I have this book by John Hott. I think he's a theologian. You guys can check it out. The Cosmic Vision of Teilhard de Chardin. So these guys, they still are talking about this idea from a theological perspective, and there's no cross communication also. And I think it's because of their own hangups, right? There's some folks who are focused on the theology, and there's some folks focused, like you see the dichotomy, right? They're focused on the science. So there's not a strong incentive for the schools of thought to find points of reconciliation. They're inherently at odds with each other, and so there's a constant schism. My job, as I see it, is to bring to bear all of these ideas and to see how we can synthesize the thought with reconciling the apparent differences. And that's one of my key missions here. So thank you so much, guys, for listening to me today. I know I have a tendency to get uh, go on a bunch of different asides, but I hope that is beneficial to you. I'm here, the human me. I'm not leveraging, other than helping with my outline. I'm not leveraging AI, or I'm not just following along some very specific talking points. This is just me going with what I know from the books that I read, from the materials that I've sourced, and trying to figure out how we can overall improve ourselves and improve our lot in life and improve our planet from this very unique niche-based perspective that I think has a lot of value and will continue having value for people that especially work in crypto, parallel societies, etc. So see you guys. Good chat. I really enjoyed doing this session. Let's do it again next time. We've gone almost an hour on the dot, if you count when I officially started speaking. Cheers, my friends.